I'm Hemant Mehta.
And I'm Jessica Blimke.
And you're listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com. You can now listen to all of our episodes and see show notes at FriendlyAtheistPodcast.com.
Shulem Deen is a former Hasidic Jew. Since leaving that world, he's founded the website unpious.com, which is a voice for other ultra-Orthodox Jews who may be rethinking their faith. And his new book is called All Who Go Do Not Return. Shulem, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start by talking about kind of what it means to be a Hasidic Jew for those of us who don't have a lot of experience with that world.
Well, the world of Hasidic Jews is essentially, it is a stream within ultra-Orthodoxy, which is a stream within Orthodoxy, Jewish Orthodoxy, and that is complying with a very defined set of dogmas and a very strict set of rules that apply to day-to-day life. That is first and foremost what it means. In addition, Hasidic Jews go sort of beyond what regular Orthodoxy is, and they espouse a philosophy of rejectionism and separatism, remaining apart from the outside world. They do that by distinguishing themselves in the way that they dress, in the language that they speak. Hasidim who live here in the United States do not speak English day to day. They speak Yiddish. They wear, I don't know where you guys are based, but in New York City you can see Hasidim, and they wear these very distinctive outfits, long black coats and black fur hats. Mm-hmm. They've got these little side curl things from their, with the hair. And this is one way that they separate themselves from the rest of society. Much more importantly is they avoid whatever kind of influence could seep in from the surrounding culture. So Hasidim emphasize not going to college, not reading secular material, not watching TV or movies, not reading secular newspapers, things like that. And so essentially Hasidim are mostly, especially in the United States, they're mostly centered in and around New York. Mm-hmm. But despite living within such a cosmopolitan world, within such a geographically such a cosmopolitan area, Hasidim are pretty much sort of they've created these enclaves in which they could live on their own without mingling with the surrounding culture. But also, it has to be said, they take full advantage of what the surrounding culture has to give them in terms of advanced, say, medical care and being able to use whatever technology the world has available to them. So they're not like the Amish, where they don't use technology. They do use technology, and they do make use of the world, and they make a lot of use of the political system in very distinct ways that are designed to benefit the community. So that's the basic. That's what Hasidic Jews, especially in the United States, that's sort of how I would describe it.
So when you talk about it, it almost sounds like you think it's a little hypocritical of them to take advantage of what's around them while still withdrawing from it. Is that a fair read on what you said, or is that jumping too far?
Yes, well, I mean, I usually don't jump right into criticism about them because I try to maintain a little bit of neutrality, at least at the outset. But yes, I do have. I think that's philosophically problematic to be part of a world that you benefit from, and you acknowledge its value. You acknowledge the value of science because you use it. A Hasidic Jew has to go from New York to London or to Jerusalem or to wherever, he'll get on a plane. But Hasidim are not themselves producing aerodynamics engineers. They're not themselves producing physicists. They're not themselves producing doctors and scientists, which means they say, we will take advantage of all the advances and the progress that humanity has made, but we will not engage in that process. And I think that's philosophically problematic, and somewhat morally problematic, I think. But that might be a somewhat more involved and nuanced critique of that culture.
Sure.
I think there are bigger problems and more immediate problems with that community, and that is they have an unsustainable economic system where people are very much expected to rely on both communal and government benefits as a matter of course, in order to be able to create large families. It's what I call, the Hasidic community relies on what I call the unholy trifecta of very meager secular education, early marriage, and the pressure to breed early and often. And so that creates structures of dependency that make it really, really difficult for someone later on to decide, oh, I don't really want to be a Hasidic Jew, because by then you already have 5 kids and you have a job within the community, and there's nothing really you can do. You just can't give that up. And so that's pretty much, I mean, it may or may not be entirely by design, but to some degree it is. And that sort of creates an environment where people have to stay within and keeps them trapped, and that, I think, is a very serious problem.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit more then about kind of your own journey out of that community. Where did did you have a crisis of faith, or what happened?
I had a major crisis of faith. It started with little glimpses that I got of the outside world. I was living in a very particular community that is probably the most insular Hasidic community in the United States. The community is known as the Skverers, the Skver Hasidim. The Hasidic world is subdivided into sects. There are the Satmars and the Vishniters and the Belzers. And so the Skverers are another sect. And usually these sects they're just based on the town of origin where they're from in Eastern Europe. But this particular sect is a very insular sect based in a small village in Lapland County, about 30 minutes north of New York City. It is an all Hasidic village, one way in, one way out, about 12, 13, maybe 15,000 inhabitants. The sidewalks have signs saying men's side, women's side. The sexes are completely segregated. There are no mixed events ever, except for intimate family events, but otherwise completely separate. Boys receive almost no secular education whatsoever. I have 2 boys, aged 13 and 15, who cannot speak, read, or write English. The girls get a somewhat better secular education for reasons, I can go into that later, but boys are expected to study Jewish law and the Talmud from early morning until late at night. And young men are expected to do that too, to devote their life to study as much as they can. And that's the community that I came from. And at some point in my 20s, I started to gain access to the outside world. One night I turned on the radio, and it was the middle of the night, and my wife was asleep, and I found a pair of headphones, and I realized that we had a working radio in our apartment because we had a cassette player, and I was supposed to disable the radio, but I never got around to it. So I was just really curious about what the outside world has to say, and so I plugged in the set of earphones and started listening, and I was just absolutely mesmerized just by the most mundane aspects of the outside world. Traffic reports and weather reports. It was just amazing to me. The huge mat for sale in Paramus, New Jersey. That was incredible. And traffic backed up on the Brooklyn Bridge all the way to the BQE. So
I've never heard anybody say their introduction to the world of technology was through a cassette player / radio. Wait till you hear about MP3s and torrents and everything.
Right. Well, and then came, I started, at some point I realized I needed a job because I had 3 kids and I needed to find a way to support them. And I had not been, I'd been taught how to conduct commerce in 1st century Palestine or in 5th century Babylonia,
And you couldn't find work
but I had
doing
no
that?
idea what a resume was. I was taught how to slaughter an ox in Jerusalem's ancient temple. I could even, skin it and separate the priestly portions. But I was taught not a thing about the economic realities of living in the modern world now. And so I had 2 or 3 kids, and I realized I had to find some way to support them. And so I left my studies and tried to get a job as a teacher. And I was working with young kids who were having, some of them had special needs. They were, bright kids, but they needed a little help in their Talmud study. And I thought I would get a computer because a computer would let me make worksheets for them that would help them in their studies. And so I got this computer, and with the computer was a 3.5-inch floppy disk that said America Online free trial. And I popped that into the slot, and it said type A:\install, which I did, and told my wife that I don't know what this is, but apparently you're not going to be able to use the phone for the next 30 minutes. And I, listened to the wheezy, windy tones of connecting to AOL, and then welcome, you've got mail. I don't know if you guys were big AOL users back in 1996.
When I became an atheist, AOL was also my gateway to finding out about atheism without anybody knowing about it. Yeah.
Oh.
There you go. Well, you were way ahead of me because.
Well, I'd listened to the radio for a while, so.
Right. So you had a real head start there. But I listened to. So I got onto AOL, and suddenly there's a world of news and shopping and chat rooms. It was amazing. I was in a chat room. I was living in this tiny little, really insular village, and here I could speak to outsiders, and I start typing, and they're typing back, and it was just incredible. I called my wife. I said, "Look at this. This is amazing." And she said, "So what? It's like a phone. Just you have to type." I said,
was she impressed by it, or was she like, "This is a bad idea. Get the heck off of the AOL"?
She didn't understand it. She had a completely different kind of personality.
Sure.
She was just different. She didn't have. I was always very curious, and I was always sort of looking and sort of trying to catch glimpses of the outside world and things like that. And I was a very good, devout Hasid, doing everything I needed to do, but I also had this kind of insatiable curiosity. And so something like the internet was, it opened up a world to me. And in chat rooms, I met people that I would never have met in real life and had certain conversations with them. They weren't necessarily earth-shattering conversations, but they were conversations that gave me a glimpse into the way people outside of our community thought. And so that was really important in realizing not necessarily that my worldview was wrong, but realizing that there are people who seem to be reasonably sane, who have different worldviews. And so that was an important step. And another important step was eventually I had to get a car, and one day drove over to the public library, which was not something I was supposed to do, but I was kind of curious to see what the library had to offer. I had never been in a public library before. So I was around 24, 25, and I get into the public library, and I get into the children's section. And in the children's section right there is a set of World Book encyclopedias. And so I took out one volume, started reading it, and it was fascinating. It was, for the first time in my life, I started reading about the Beatles and Elvis and Bruce Springsteen and, and art and literature and philosophy and psychology and computers. These things it was suddenly like I had the whole world in front of me. And I remember sitting down at one of the kids' tables in the children's section. Like on one side of me was a little boy reading the Bernstein Bears, and then on the other side was a girl reading Amelia Bedelia or whatever it was, and I was there with my pile of encyclopedias, just like piling up. And these are children's encyclopedias technically, but they're very good. The World Book Encyclopedia is not. It's made for sort of teenagers and things like that. And
just wait till I tell you about Encarta. You are going to love
Right.
it.
I
Well,
had the World Book
I mean,
encyclopedias growing
at some
up.
point I thought I shouldn't be in the children's section, and I went up to look for the adult encyclopedia. But Encyclopedia Britannica really did not have the same appeal
Yeah.
as, the World Book. And I needed some pictures, and the World Book had some pictures.
So let me jump forward a little bit. At some point, you're getting all
Sure.
this outside knowledge. When does it become a conflict with your wife, with your parents, with your community?
Well, eventually, from the children's section, I made my way to the adult section, and I found myself in the religion aisle. And the religion aisle, as you might expect, and then I found myself in the religion aisle because I was now aware that such a thing as science existed, and I knew that there were modern academics who must have studied some of these things. And I ended up in the religion section because I was really curious to see whether there are any studies that confirm things like the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. And the Israelite migration from Egypt to Canaan, and whether the patriarchs Abram, Isaac, and Jacob from the Hebrew Bible, whether they were real people. I was sure that they were, but I wanted to see the evidence for it, and I was certain that there must be scholars somewhere who found some evidence for it. And lo and behold, the biblical archaeology studies that I came across were giving me just the opposite of that. And that was pretty disturbing to me. And then I started reading about comparative religions and started realizing that, how similar all religions are, and how it's pretty obvious that religion comes to respond to a very basic human need. And it makes a lot more sense to realize, to see it in that way. But this didn't happen. This didn't happen overnight. This was a very, very long process. But over time, I came to really just see religion in a completely different way. And so, yes, for me, it was one long process of discovering the outside world and then realizing that the outside world has so much to say on the things that I believed in, and had so much to say that contradicted the things that I believed in. And suddenly I found myself in a major crisis, realizing that modern scholarship really completely tore apart everything that I believed. I mean, not everything is disproven. There may not be evidence that completely disproves the biblical narrative 100%, but the evidence is pretty compelling. That say the Bible was authored by man rather than by God.
Shulem, let me ask you: do you think
Sure.
the leaders of your Hasidic community, are they aware of all this and trying to keep everyone else from accessing that information? Or do you think they lived in the same sort of bubble that you grew up in where all of this was unfamiliar?
Right. Well, I think yes and no. I think the number one answer, I think, is really yes. The leaders within that community really don't know much about the outside world beyond what is practical for leading their community. In other words, they know a lot about the political system. They know a lot about, healthcare issues. They know a lot about things like that. They do not know about modern scholarship. To say, the leader of the Sfera Hasidim, who is the Rebbe, he's sort of like the supreme leader, and that village is, in some ways, it's kind of a quasi-theocracy, and he's at the top. He's an extremely sheltered person. In other words, if you're just a regular Hasid, you could get into your car, and despite all admonitions against it, you can turn on the radio if you want. The top-tier leaders can't do that. There's no way. And so they have no access to information. So they really have an extremely limited grasp of the outside world, and they have a really limited grasp of modern science and modern scholarship and things like that. But some of this is very intentional, and the ideology that was set up to separate Hasidim from the rest of the world was put in place It's an ideology that's about 150 years old, and it was put in place in response to the age of the Enlightenment, especially as it affected the Jewish community in Eastern Europe and parts of Western Europe, specifically in Germany, Austria, and that's where it started, and then it spread to the Orthodox Jews who lived in Poland and Russia, who were being threatened by Enlightenment forces. Approximately in the mid 19th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, was when Jewish studies became an academic field. And so that had traditional leaders very concerned, and so they created this philosophy of any religious innovation and any kind of outside influence is forbidden. And that sort of carried over, and that's still what the Hasidim still stick to today. So it was conscious, it was a very conscious and deliberate closing out of the outside world back then. And now, to some degree, it's still conscious. They're really, really afraid of the outside world. And I think that they know, as many fundamentalists with any sense know, that the outside world contains a lot of dangers to their worldview. I actually firmly believe that. I think that the more intelligent religious fundamentalists are fundamentalists sometimes precisely because they have the instinct that the outside world really is a threat. And so that, in response to that, they become even more fierce in their opposition to the outside world. But that certainly is the case within the Hasidic community.
I don't know if this is an offensive analogy. I don't mean it to be, but it almost sounds like North Korea in a certain way where everyone is so sheltered, and there's this debate about whether we should free them, but they don't necessarily know any better. They don't know what's outside. Right. They think everything's great.
Yeah.
Right. I think that analogy is not imperfect. It's not perfect, but it's not imperfect. I think there's certainly elements of brainwashing that are very similar. But I would make the case that within this community that there's a big debate between my friends and myself, others who've left, and myself about whether we have an obligation to advocate for those who are still within, to be activists for this cause of changing their society. And in general, my feeling is that maybe it is not completely the right thing to do, to try to change a community that is trying to maintain its values and its worldview. And if it's a community that I've left and no longer have that kind of personal stake in it, maybe it isn't really my place to advocate for reform. On the other hand, there are young people being sort of pressured into marriages and to have children right away with no knowledge of birth control and no understanding of their options, no knowledge that they can go to college and they can become educated and they can learn about the world and they can find economic opportunities beyond what the community will offer them. And maybe the outside world has an obligation to go in and at least to some extent make sure that people are aware of their options. Right now, there's a huge problem in Hasidic communities, especially in New York. They provide very, very meager secular education, as I said before, especially to boys. And this is clearly against the law. But New York City and state officials are simply not enforcing the state-mandated educational curriculum for private schools. And the reason they give is that it is not their place to launch an investigation, and so they don't get involved in the actions of Hasidic private schools. And so even though private schools have to provide a certain set of of subjects that they teach and have to provide the equivalent of what public schools provide. They simply don't, and nobody cares.
So they're not taking action on it, and it's because it's a religious community. They don't want to get involved and like stir up some religious conflict.
And it's because it's a religious community, and more importantly, let's acknowledge it's a very politically powerful community.
So let's talk about that. I want to ask you about a few things that I've heard about the Orthodox Jewish community, ultra-Orthodox community. Tell me if this is accurate, first of all, and then I'd love to hear your take on it. We'll do a few of these. So first about political issues. I believe I heard a story that in New York, at least in one part of it, in a public school district, the ultra-Orthodox Jews made it so that they ran for the school board, won a majority of the seats, and then could dictate certain curriculum decisions, price, like how much money taxpayers were giving to the district, or lack thereof. Mm-hmm. And that totally messed with the public school system. Is that accurate, first of all, and is that something that goes on in that world?
Yeah, it's an episode of
This American Life did an episode on it.
Yeah.
Yes. So that you're talking about the East Ramapo School District, which has been over the past decade has been taken over by not by Orthodox Jews, not only Hasidim, some non-Hasidim, but mostly Hasidic Jews. And this is, the reason they did it was because they were paying really, really high property taxes for a school system that they did not use. That's originally how all this started, because the East Roundhouse School District, which is a district in Rockland County, which New Square, which is a place that I was from, is also part of it. It's on the periphery of it, but it's part of it.
So they were paying taxes for a school that their kids didn't attend, and they were mad about it.
So right, and the school taxes kept going up, and the property taxes, basically their property taxes, kept going up, and a huge portion of property taxes go for schools. And so the Orthodox community decided that, there's a school board that is made up entirely of people who had the interests of public school students in mind, but did not have the interests of the taxpayers in mind. And so the Orthodox community made this kind of, made this argument that if they're the ones paying for it, they should be able to have some control, and they put forward their candidates, and they were elected. And so they were able to take over. And now what happens when you put in candidates who are only interested in reducing property taxes, but have none of their own kids in the public schools, then they're just going to start, they have no interest in, or they have a lot less interest in keeping the educational curricula as robust as if they had a personal stake in it. I mean, that's a fairly simple assumption that you can make. I mean, even without completely painting them as villains, it's a pretty natural human response that if your interest is in your taxes, then that's the thing you're going to pay attention to. And so they've taken over, and unfortunately what it affects most, the student body that is most affected by it is a Black and Hispanic community, which is the other part of the East Ramapo community. And so the children have simply had their classes and their programs completely cut in many cases, and some of it's just absolutely awful. And the Spring Valley public schools and the Spring Valley High School were known for many years for many of their programs. They had a great marching band, and they had great other, they'd won awards, and all of these programs were completely slashed. And it was slashed by the school board. Now, the school board argues that it's not really their fault. The school board says that it has to do with the formula, but the state formula that provides funding to public schools, to school districts, does not work well in this case because the tax. I'm not an expert on this, and I'm not exactly clear on how this works. But apparently there is something in the formula that affects this district uniquely because the public school students are generally from low-income families, or something like. I shouldn't. I'm
No,
not
that's okay.
entirely
That
sure.
that explains like kind of their involvement in it.
Right. So it gets really complicated, and so the This American Life story was a very sort of very very much skewed sort of against the Hasidic community, and I was. I get upset about the things that the Hasidic community does, and so I was kind of in favor of This American Life taking them to task. But there were some others who argued that there were some really solid arguments on the other side, and they weren't given, they weren't really addressed. But I think it's a very complex issue.
Sure.
And then I think the root of the problem is that because Hasidim maintain such separate communities, and so their interests are so different from their neighbors and the surrounding communities, and so when the two come together, they just clashes are inevitable.
Sure. And also there's an argument to be made that even if your kids don't go to public schools, having strong after-school programs are great for the community because it keeps kids out of trouble, helps them academically, so on and so forth.
Absolutely. I mean, that's essentially the argument why everyone should support public schools.
Right.
I mean, we have old people or young people or people who have no kids in school. We have them paying school taxes because we need young kids we need kids to get an education.
Right.
Whether they're our kids or somebody else's kids.
Right.
So absolutely.
So we have actually one more thing I really wanted to discuss with you. Recently in the news, there was some issues with, I believe it was Hasidic Jews, but I'm not sure, on airplanes saying that they couldn't or wouldn't sit near women and asked that the flight seating was kind of rearranged for their needs.
Yeah, they wanted the women to get up off of their seats and go somewhere else so that they didn't have to sit next to them. What up with that?
Right.
That sounds fun.
So, yeah, I mean, this is another one of these issues that comes up, and frankly, I think that the people who do this are crazy religious nuts. I would say that it's probably not the majority of Hasidic Jews who behave this way, but it does come up, and that's what makes the news, and it is pretty infuriating. It's infuriating when I read about it, but it is not absolute law that a Hasidic person may not, if he's a man, he may not sit next to a woman. Mm-hmm. But there are some who, they're so sheltered and they're taught that they cannot sit next to women, and then they come onto a plane and they're suddenly surrounded by people from an entirely different culture, and so they sort of lack the finesse, for lack of a better word, for how to go about this. And so they'll just, you'll have some man who all day long he sits in the synagogue or in the yeshiva and he studies the Talmud, and now he's on an airplane to Tel Aviv, and he's assigned a seat next to a woman, and he'll just stand there and say, "No, I can't sit here."
That leads to all sorts of chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now think about if it's right before the holidays and it's a whole group of dozens of religious men going to Jerusalem or something, and suddenly you have sort of a mass problem and a big situation and an 11-hour delay or something like that. And so these things do happen. I don't think it's the majority of Hasidim who do these things, but they do happen, and then it's pretty infuriating.
I have one last question for you. Sorry, we lied. One last question. Ever since you started talking about this stuff publicly, ever since your book came out, what response have you heard from within the community? Are there other ex-Hasidim who have contacted you? Have you heard from people who are still within that community who are pissed off at you? What's the deal?
Oh, I get lots of messages all the time. I would basically divide them into two categories. One is people who write me, or especially from the Hasidic community, from the Orthodox community, people who write me saying, I am in your exact place where you were 10 years ago. I really dislike it here. Help me. How do I get out? And the other part is people who write me saying that, you're completely wrong. How could you do this? I can prove to you that all your conclusions are mistaken and you really need to come back and stop all this nonsense of becoming a secular person because you're losing out and you're not being a good Jew. So the latter ones are amusing, but nothing more. The former are kind of heartbreaking because these are people writing to me and telling me that, they're in this world, they're stuck, they've got children, they've got family members, they can't just leave just to get out. The concept really is so difficult. It's not like, a New Yorker who decides he's had enough of New York can, get up and move to Boston. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have to find a new job, but you can do it. It's not, it's a big life decision, but it's not like moving to Mars. Mm-hmm. For a Hasid to leave his community or her community, it's really like moving to another planet. And that really is not an exaggeration. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe not Mars, because, you can't actually live on Mars, but it really is fundamentally, it is...
Which you would know if you read a science book.
Yes, right. But really, it is a transition that is as big as moving from a completely third world country to a very developed and advanced country without knowing anyone and without knowing the language. Yeah. And it is really scary. And so most people who want to do it are just too frightened by the prospect of failure, and they don't even know where to start. And so these are the people that I have a lot of sympathy for. And I'm involved with an organization. I'll just throw this in. It's called Footsteps. It's a New York City-based organization, and they do incredible work, even life-saving work, for people who leave the ultra-Orthodox community and need assistance with just whether it's just social support or college scholarships or people who need legal help in court if a parent leaves and they want to hold on to their children, or they want to at least maintain contact with their children, but the community raises thousands of dollars to keep the children away from them, which was something that happened in my case. So this organization, Footsteps, has the Family Services Division that provides legal representation to parents who are struggling with a family court situation. So this is one of the ways that I am very heavily involved in trying to not necessarily encourage people to leave, but to offer a helping hand to those who do want to make the choice to leave.
Well, we will have links to all of the organizations you mentioned and your book in the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you giving us some insight into that world.
Thank you, Hamid, and thanks, Jessica.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com. This episode was taped at Cinnamon Sound Studios in Aurora, Illinois, and the music was written and performed by Brad Chagdis. If you like what you're hearing, please consider making a contribution at patreon.com/Hemant, that's He-Man T. We appreciate your support. I'm Hemant Mehta.
And I'm Jessica Blumke. We hope you'll join us next time.